Hello, everyone joining us in person and via Zoom. Good evening and welcome to this panel discussion hosted by #Generation in collaboration with Verite Research and the Sri Lanka Press Institute. Fact-checking is unfortunately not quite a priority for many people, despite the growing need for it to be a daily practice. Disinformation, as well as misinformation and malinformation, have fueled crisis situations the world over and here at home. Today, Sri Lankans find themselves in especially troubled waters, with every citizen focusing on the current economic crisis. Crisis creates storylines and narratives that often propagate without much regulation, leaving space for misinterpretation, misrepresentation, and falsehoods to also filter into widespread discourse. In fact, the impact of disinformation can also be so drastic that it in itself can be considered a crisis or an attack on information. We at #Generation began our fact-checking exercise in March of 2021. A year later, we have published almost 60 fact checks, some of which are trilingual and available on our social medias. Tomorrow, the 2nd of April, is International Fact-Checking Day. And we felt that this discussion is an urgent and necessary one, especially in light of unparalleled citizen engagement in light of the current economic conditions. Today, we are joined by 4 experts in this field: Dr. Gehan Gunatilaka, Dilrukshi Handunetti, Lakna Pranama, and Kasun Kumarage. Thank you for your time and your knowledge, and we look forward to an illuminating discussion. With that, I would like to hand over the proceedings to Rebecca David, project lead at #Generation.
Thank you, Sarita, and warm welcome to all of you once again. So we have some line of presentations, and then we go into a time of panel discussion. So before we go into a time of presentation, I would now call upon Harsha Silva, who is the social media analyst at #Generation, and he's also the fact checker for #Generation. So he will make his introductory remarks, and then we'll move on from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarita. Thank you, Rebecca. So the fact-checking day is on April 2nd, and we were thinking about doing something for the International Fact-Checking Day. So we had kind of discussions among ourselves, doing something because it's very important, and we started almost over a year ago. And also when we're thinking about that, there are Sri Lankan other organizations who are doing fact-checking, and we reach out to SLPI, Verite. So why we do the good things alone, we bring out people to fight against disinformation. So we reach out to them, and we think about doing a kind of a big event more than this, but eventually all the troubles and everything that's going around the country, and also the power cuts, all those minimize this event to this kind of a small event where we have presentations from Verite and SLPI, and kind of a panel discussion. And also it's very important because the priorities of the society today are not fact-checking because of the power, the gas shortage, and then everything. The event will go in kind of a bilingual event where the presentations done in English and Sinhala are kind of bilingual. And the first presentations will be done by Verite Research, where they outline the trends of disinformation and their fact-checking work. And then the SLPI will do a kind of a summary about what they have done, what they have seen throughout the last year. At #, me and my colleagues have done almost, as Sarita said, 60 fact checks, where we especially focused on what goes in social media. And also we were able to publish all of them in Sinhala, but we tried much as possible to do in Sinhala and Tamil because everything goes in social media doesn't have a kind of a specific language, because it comes in Sinhala, sometimes in English, sometimes in Tamil. For a important example where we have seen that the COVID disinformation that was spread all around the world, now translated into Sinhala and spreading within our communities. So I'll invite Verity Research now and hand over my mic to Rebecca. Okay. Verity.
Thank you, Harshana. සුබ සන්ධ්‍යාවක් ඔක්කොටම. මම රතිකා වෙරිටේ රිසර්ච් ආයතනය විසින් පවත්වාගෙන යන factcheck.lk කණ්ඩායමේ පර්යන්තයේ සහකාර කළමනාකරණීය විදිහට තමයි මම කටයුතු කරන්නේ. ඉතින් ඒ වගේම අද මාත් එක්ක ඉන්නවා අපේ factcheck.lk කණ්ඩායමේ කළමනාකරණීය මහෞෂධි. ඉතින් අපි අද hashtag පරපුර සහ ශ්‍රී ලංකා පුවත්පත් ආයතනය සමග ඔබත් එක්ක එකතු වෙන්නේ හර්ෂණ කලින් කිව්වා වගේ ජාත්‍යන්තර කරුණු පරීක්ෂා කිරීම දිනය නිමිති කරගෙන. ඉතින් මේ අවස්ථාවේදී අපි බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා ඇත්තටම ප්‍රධාන මාතෘකා දෙකක් ඔස්සේ අද කතා කරන්න. ඉතින් එතනදී පළවෙනි මාතෘකාව මම හඳුන්වලා දුන්නොත් අපි පෙන්වලා දෙන්න කැමති කරුණු පරීක්ෂා කිරීමේ ක්‍රියාවලියේ වැදගත්කම මොකක්ද කියන එක. විශේෂයෙන්ම මේ දේශපාලන ක්ෂේත්‍රය තුළ තියෙන වැරදි තොරතුරු, දුස්තොරතුරු ඒවත් එක්ක ඊට ඉදිරිව අපි කටයුතු කරගෙන යද්දී කරුණු පරීක්ෂා කිරීමේ ක්‍රියාවලියේ භූමිකාව මොකක්ද? ඇයි කරුණු පරීක්ෂා කිරීමක් කියන එක අවශ්‍ය වෙන්නේ? ඒකේ වැදගත්කම මොකක්ද කියන එක ගැන අපි පළවෙනියෙන්ම කතා කරන්න බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා. ඒ වගේම තමයි අපි මේ ශාස්ත්‍රයේ රැඳිලා ඉන්න කාලය අතරතුර අපිට අවබෝධ වෙලා තියෙන දෙයක් තමයි මේ දේශපාලන ශාස්ත්‍රය තුළ දකින්න තියෙන දුස්තොරතුරු ප්‍රචාරය වෙන ආකාරය බැලුවාම අපිට විවිධ රටාවන් ඒ සම්බන්ධයෙන් දකින්න ලැබිලා තියෙනවා. ඉතින් මේ රටාවන් මොනවද කියලා හඳුන්වලා දෙන්න මේ ඉදිරිපත් කිරීමේ දෙවැනි කොටස විදිහට අපි අද බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා. තව කියන්න කැමති කරුණක් තමයි මේකෙදි මේ අද පළවෙනි මාතෘකාව සිංහල භාෂාවෙන් මම ඉදිරිපත් කරනවා. ඒ වගේම දෙවැනි මාතෘකාව ඉංග්‍රීසි භාෂාවෙන් ඉදිරිපත් කරන්න මහෞෂධි බලාපොරොත්තු වෙමින් සිටිනවා. ඉතින් ඇයි කරුණු පරීක්ෂා කිරීමේ ක්‍රියාවලියක් අවශ්‍ය වෙන්නේ? මොකක්ද ඒකේ වැදගත්කම? ඉතින් මම හිතන්නේ අපි හැමෝම දන්නවා ජනතාව විදියට ඔබත් මමත් අපි සියලු දෙනාම අද තොරතුරු විශාල ප්‍රමාණයක් සමග අපිට ගනුදෙනු කරන්න වෙලා තියෙනවා. විශේෂයෙන්ම අර මුලින් සඳහන් කරා වගේ වර්තමාන අර්බුදකාරී තත්ත්වය බැලුවාම මේක මම හිතන්නේ තවත් වර්ධනය වීමක් අපි මේ අවස්ථාවේදී අපිට දකින්න ලැබෙනවා. ඉතින් මේ විදියට තොරතුරු විශාල ප්‍රමාණයක් එක්ක අපිට ගනුදෙනු කරන්න වෙනකොට අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම අපිට ඇතිවන ගැටලුවක් තමයි අපි කොහොමද මේවා ඇත්ත නැත්ත කියන එක තෝරලා බේරලා ගන්නෙ. ඒක අපිට බොහොම අමාරු කාර්යයක් වෙනවා. සත්‍ය තොරතුරු මොකක්ද? සත්‍ය වසන් කරලා තියෙන්නේ කොහෙද? සත්‍ය විකෘති කිරීමක් තියලා තියෙන්නේ කොහෙද? ඒ වගේම තමයි මුළුමනින්ම වැරදි ප්‍රකාශ මොනවාද? ඉතින් මේ විදිහට විමසිල්ලෙන් බලලා තේරුම් ගන්න එක මම හිතන්නේ අපිට අද ගොඩක් අමාරු කාර්යයක්. ඉතින් ඒ වගේම දැන් මේ ගැටලුව දිහා අපිට විවිධ පැතිකඩ වලින් බලන්න පුළුවන්. ඉතින් එහෙම බලනකොට අපිට පෙනී යන තවත් දෙයක් තමයි දැන් ලෝකේ ගොඩක් රටවල් වගේ ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ දේශපාලඥයින් තමන්ගේ විවිධ දේශපාලන අරමුණු ඉටු කරගන්න වැරදි තොරතුරු නිර්මාණය කිරීමට පෙළඹෙනවා. ඒ වගේම තමයි එහෙමත් නැත්නම් වැරදි තොරතුරු අරගෙන අතිශයෝක්තියෙන් ප්‍රකාශ කිරීමට ප්‍රචාරය කිරීමට ඒ අය යොමු වෙනවා. මේ ගැටලුවේම තියෙන තවත් පැතිකඩක් තමයි මාධ්‍ය විසින් බොහෝ වෙලාවට මේ විදියට සිදු කෙරෙන ඒ වැරදි ප්‍රචාරයන්, වැරදි ප්‍රකාශයන් සත්‍යසත්‍යභාවය විමසීමකින් තොරව ඒ විදිහටම මාධ්‍ය හරහා වාර්තා කරනවා. ඉතින් මෙතනදී ඇතිවෙන ප්‍රතිඵලයක් තමයි දේශපාලනඥයින් සහ උසස් බලධාරීන්ට හැකියාවක් ලැබිලා තියෙනවා කිසිම ආකාරයක වගවීමකට ලක් වෙන්නේ නැතුව වැරදි ප්‍රකාශ මාධ්‍ය හරහා ප්‍රචාරය කරන්න. ඉතින් ඒ වගේම තමයි මෙතනදී වෙන තවත් ප්‍රතිඵලයක් ඇතිවන තවත් ප්‍රතිඵලයක් තමයි මේ විදිය නිවැරදි නොවන තොරතුරු සමාජයට යද්දී සමාජ මතය කියන එක ගොඩනගන්නේ මෙන්න මේ නිවැරදි නොවන වැරදි තොරතුරු මත පදනම් වෙලා. ඉතින් එතකොට මහ ජනතාව නිවැරදි නොවන සනාථ නොවූ තොරතුරු විශ්වාස කරද්දී ඒ අයට බැරිව යනවා වැඩදායී විදිහට ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදී ක්‍රියාවලියට සම්බන්ධ වෙන්න. ඉතින් මේක අපි ගොඩක් දුරට දකිනවා. ඇත්තටම මේකේ ප්‍රතිඵලය මැතිවරණයක් පවත්වලා මහජන නියෝජිතයන් තෝරාපත් කරගන්න යන අවස්ථාවේදී. මොකද එතනදී බුද්ධිමත් තේරීමක් සිදු කිරීමට තරම් අවශ්‍ය දැනුම සහ අවබෝධය මහජනතාවට නැත්නම් ඒ ආකාරයේ බුද්ධිමත් තේරීමක් සිදු කරන්න ඒ අයට බැරිව යනවා. ඒ අයට අපහසු වෙනවා. ඉතින් මේ ගැටලුවට විසඳුමක් විදිහට තමයි ඇත්තටම වර්තමානයේ සහ හැම කාලෙදිම මේ කරුණු පරීක්ෂා කිරීම කියන මේ ක්‍රියාවලිය අවශ්‍ය වෙන්නේ සහ වැදගත් වෙන්නේ. ඉතින් මෙතනදී ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ ජනතාවට නිවැරදි තොරතුරු මේ ආශ්‍රිතව ලබා දෙන අරමුණින් තමයි ඒ කාර්යයට සම්බන්ධ වෙන්න 2018 අපේ පාර්ලිමේන්තය factcheck.lk පාර්ලිමේන්තය අපි ආරම්භ කරේ. ඉතින් මෙතනදී factcheck.lk පාර්ලිමේන්තයේ තියෙන විශේෂත්වයක් තමයි අපි හැමතිස්සෙම දේශපාලන ශාස්ත්‍රයට අදාළව පමණක් තමයි අපේ කරුණු පරීක්ෂා කිරීමේ ක්‍රියාවලියේ යෙදෙන්නේ. ඉතින් ඒ ආශ්‍රිතව ගත්තම අපිට තියෙන අභියෝග ගැන කතා කරොත් ඇත්තටම අපි හැමතිස්සෙම බලන්න ඍජුව සම්බන්ධ වෙන්න දේශපාලඥයින්ව තමන් කරන ප්‍රකාශ සම්බන්ධයෙන් වගවීම එහෙමනම් වගවීමට ලක් කරන එකට එය ප්‍රවර්ධනය කරන එකට තමයි අපි හැමතිස්සෙම ඍජුව සම්බන්ධ වෙන්න උත්සාහ කරන්නේ. ඉතින් මේ විදිහට අපි ඒ අංශයෙන් කටයුතු කරද්දී මම හිතන්නේ අපි factcheck.lk පාර්ලිමේන්තය ආරම්භ කරද්දී අපිට තිබුණා අරමුණ තුනක්. පළවෙනි අරමුණ තමයි ඡන්දයෙන් පත් කරගන්න අපේ මහජන නියෝජිතයන්ව තමන් සිදු කරන ප්‍රකාශ සම්බන්ධයෙන් වගවීමට ලක් කරන එක. ඒ වගේම තමයි අපිට තිබිච්ච දෙවෙනි අරමුණ මහජනතාවට තමන්ට වැදගත් කියලා හිතන මාතෘකා සම්බන්ධයෙන් නිවැරදි සත්‍ය මත පදනම් වූ තොරතුරු තමන්ට පහසුවෙන්ම ළඟා වෙන පුළුවන් ආකාරයකට පවත්වාගෙන යන එක. සහ තුන්වෙනි අරමුණ අපේ පර්යන්තයට තිබුණ සහ දැනටත් අපේ අරමුණක් වෙන ඒක තමයි ජනතාව සහ මාධ්‍ය අතර මේ කරුණු පිරික්සීමේ ඒ ක්‍රියාවලිය ප්‍රචලිත කරලා ඒ ආශ්‍රිතව සංස්කෘතිය බිහි කරලා ජනතාව වඩාත් තමන් අසන දේ සම්බන්ධයෙන් තමන් දකින දේ තොරතුරු සම්බන්ධයෙන් විමසිල්ලෙන් යුතුව තොරතුරු පරිභෝජනය කරන තැනට යොමු කරන එක. ඉතින් මම කලින් සඳහන් කරා වගේ මේ ක්‍රියාවලිය යෙදෙද්දී අපිට දකින්න ලැබිලා තියෙන විශේෂයෙන්ම දේශපාලන ක්ෂේත්‍රය තුළ යම් දුස්තරතුරු ප්‍රචාරය වීමේ තිබිච්ච යම් රටාවන් එහෙම නැත්නම් පැටර්න්ස්. ඉතින් ඒ ගැන වැඩිදුර විස්තර කරන්න මම මේ වෙලාවේ ආරාධනා කරන සිටිනවා factcheck.lk කණ්ඩායමේ අපේ කළමනාකාරිනිය මහෞෂධි පීරිස්ට. මහෞෂධි.
Thank you, Radhika, for taking us through why fact-checking is important and factcheck.lk's role in this sphere. So at this juncture, I would actually like to borrow a useful analogy that was coined by media analyst Nrkad to describe who fact-checkers are. He said to consider fact-checkers as lifeguards. They're very helpful when they're on duty and they can help you from drowning, but they can't be everywhere. So when there is no lifeguard on duty, how do you assess the waters? Are the waters safe to get into, or are they too dangerous to get into? So similarly, we need to ask ourselves this question and keep our guards up before we read, share, or believe in a piece of information, especially when it comes to claims made by political and public figures. In our work at factcheck.lk in the last 4 years, we have identified some recurring key patterns of disinformation that has been relied upon by political and public figures when making public statements. And the recurring nature of these patterns, it runs the risk of further polarizing and dividing the country's political landscape along ethno-religious and political ideologies. And factcheck.lk has published many fact checks countering and debunking public statements that fall within these patterns, some of which I will take you through today. The key takeaway here is that the next time you are to read, share, or even trust statements made by political and public figures, we encourage you to read between the lines, identify any one of these patterns, and if so, you should approach with caution. Question the source, take your steps to cross-check and verify the facts and figures, or you can simply send your claim to us to have it fact-checked for you. So now diving into these patterns. The first pattern is playing into prejudice. With this pattern, I want to highlight the disinformation spread by politicians targeting minorities. And we've often seen that politicians make inaccurate statements that may legitimize prejudicial narratives against the country's ethno-religious minority groups, and therefore they must be debunked. Here are two such falsehoods targeting minorities that have consistently made its rounds in the media. In this fact check, MP Gamampila states that a claim that is that essentially implies that Sri Lanka's national anthem cannot be sung in Tamil, and if sung in Tamil, it would be a violation of the constitution. However, our fact check shows that both Sinhala and Tamil have equal constitutional status as national and official languages. The constitution is published in all three languages. The constitution does not give primacy to any language or officially published version for its interpretation or use, unless in certain specific cases. So based on these facts, the MP's claim is false. Because if we were to follow the MP's logic, any person can equally claim that only the Tamil version of the national anthem is constitutional. And in the next fact check, MP Gamampila also makes a claim that is widely believed among some segments of the population. That is, the Sinhala population is declining and it is under threat of extinction by the rapid growth of the Muslim population. Now, in our fact check, we used the very data that the MP had provided to check his claim. And the detailed calculations can be found on our website if anyone is interested. But based on these calculations and the MP's own data, it shows that Sri Lankan Moors accounting for 12% of the total population could only happen, if at all, in 50 years and not in 10 years. And second, if the Moor population is to catch up to the Sinhala population, it would only happen in about 1,000 years, more specifically in 3082. So the math definitely showed us that it does not allow for the Sinhala population to become extinct. And moving on to our next pattern, the blame game. In this pattern, I will specifically speak on the blame game with regard to the economic crisis Sri Lanka is going through currently, with focus on how politicians pass blame on Sri Lanka's mounting debt, a topic that everyone is keen on today. Is it the former Rajapaksa government? Is it the former Yahapalana government? Is it the present government that stands to blame for the mounting debt? But instead of assigning blame to any one government, it is important to take a look at the facts before us. Here we have two fact checks. The first one, Minister Gunawardena claims that Sri Lanka's debt rose much faster in between 2015 and 2019 than over the 10-year period before that, which is between 2004 and 2014. And we found this to be false. In fact, Sri Lanka's debt grew less between 2015 and 2019 than in the 2004 to 2014 period. And something to note regarding why he's inaccurate is that the minister has mainly come to his conclusion using an inappropriate method to compare debt increases. And this inappropriate method of comparing debt is constantly used by politicians to make self-congratulatory statements. So on this, Verite has in fact done an insight on demystifying increases in Sri Lanka's debt. So if anyone's interested, you can find that on Verite Research's website. Moving on, we also have a fact check on MP John Siniviratna, who makes a similar claim that it was during the former government that Sri Lanka's foreign debt increased enormously. And although it's not clear whether he referred to central government debt or foreign debt, on either interpretation of his statement, the numbers he had cited is hugely incorrect. So this next pattern specifically focuses on the false sense of security and success that certain public officials and politicians have created during the COVID-19 pandemic, with repeated falsehoods amplified in the media. So the first pattern is we witnessed this during the pandemic, especially during the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, was a false sense of security regarding the country's COVID-19 transmission status. Both the chief epidemiologist and also the Director General of Health falsely reassured the public that Sri Lanka did not have community spread level of transmission in the country at the time they made these statements. And our fact checks crossed these claims against the definitional criteria that had been provided by the WHO. And we also evaluated the ratio of the number of PCR tests to COVID-19 cases based on MOH data and also our world in data. And none of these substantiated any one of the claims made by these officials. In fact, the data pointed to the fact that it was highly unlikely that Sri Lanka did not have community spread at this point of time. And more recently, statements on COVID-19 have moved from providing a false sense of security to a false sense of success, especially on vaccination rates achieved. At this point, I must say that the figures relating to vaccination rates, they aren't bad and in no way discrediting the government's achievement in this aspect. And they've been reasonably successful too. However, there has been gross exaggeration in the public domain as to its progress and achievement. In July 2021, Nama Rajapaksa prematurely declared that Sri Lanka was the country that had most successfully controlled the pandemic in South Asia. But based on our evaluation, Sri Lanka did not have the best outcomes, either on the number of deaths per million or the number of PCR tests, along with its positivity rate, or in terms of the percentage of the population that was vaccinated at the time the statement was made. And more recently, in fact, earlier this year, Minister Kehelia Rambukwala claimed that Sri Lanka had ranked 4th in the world with the highest vaccination percentage for its eligible population. But based on our world in data, Sri Lanka ranked 57th place for having vaccinated 64% of its total population, and in the 46th place for vaccinating 84% of its over 14 population. Therefore, at the time of the fact check, Sri Lanka never ranked in the top 5, nor in the top 45 countries in terms of the vaccination success. And this brings me to our last pattern on misconstruing rights. This pattern is specific to politicians and public figures making unsound interpretations of the law. This particular pattern can be very dangerous when it especially goes to undermine one's own fundamental rights and carries the threat of legal action. Earlier this year, SSP Talduwa made his statement claiming that criticizing the president on social media or any other media can result in legal action. And this kind of false statement has dangerous repercussions, considering the country's present situation, and also considering last night's protests. Such claims going unverified is harmful to society. Our fact check goes on to clarify that based on Article 14(1) of the Constitution, which vests every citizen with the freedom of speech and expression, and based on decided cases by the Supreme Court, merely criticizing the president or insulting the president or the government doesn't attract criminal liability. And more recently, Minister Sarath Weerasekara claimed that anyone found distorting or disrespecting the national flag can be charged under the Penal Code. However, further reading into the Penal Code confirms that the mere act of distorting doesn't automatically fall within the scope of the Penal Code, unless it is accompanied with intention to promote feelings of ill will and hostility. And on top of that, the act of disrespecting our national flag remains outside the scope of legal punishment. In fact, in a recent tweet to factcheck.lk, Minister Sarath Weerasekara suggested that he did in fact agree with factcheck.lk's verdict on his statement. And this brings me to the end of some of the key patterns of disinformation that we wanted to shed light on. The main reason we wanted to highlight these patterns is that despite having debunked these recurring claims, politicians continue to repeat same or similar claims, and they tend to be reported in the media without any verification of its accuracy, which is why Sri Lanka's media should consider to partner more with fact-checking initiatives and promote the practice of fact-checking among themselves and also the public to hold our elected representatives accountable. And I would like to end this presentation by directing our audience to check out our brand new website that is a recently refurbished factcheck.lk website, where you can find more details on the fact checks that I have spoken of today. Our website acts as a repository of information. It has very detailed evidence-based fact checks, which is written by experienced researchers and can be accessed in all 3 languages. It also allows you to engage with us more, read up on our methodology, and replicate this process just by yourselves if you want to fact check statements on your own. So this brings me to the end of our presentation. Thank you very much, #Generation, for having us, and over to you guys.
Yes, thank you, Mahoshdi, and also Radhika for that presentation and showing us the political disinformation pattern in Sri Lanka, which is very timely and useful. Thank you very much. Now, the next presentation will be by the Sri Lankan Press Institute. We will have Manisha Jayasundara, who will share the presentation, who will join us online. Over to you, Manisha.
Thank you for that. Let me share my screen. Thank you, # for having us. And on behalf of the Sri Lanka Press Institute's fact-checking team, FactSeeker, I'd like to present what we have been doing at FactSeeker. And I have with me Kasun Kumarage, SLPI's media trainer and team lead of the fact-checking unit, who will lead the next following session. And thank you, Mahoshdi, for setting the tone for today's discussion as well. So SLPI's fact-checking team has been in operation since 2020, and our objective in this initiative has been, we have four main objectives in carrying out our initiative. First is improving media literacy in Sri Lanka to promote a culture of and uplifting the public right to accurate information, because we believe that there's a spread of our increasing trend around mis and disinformation, which decreases the public right to accurate information. Then thirdly, to promote a culture of fact-based decision-making, which we think is very important today. And also, especially with the current pandemic, we also see an infodemic with an excess flow of information, that also is very dangerous. So to fight the present day infodemic is the fourth objective of FactSeeker. So with these objectives, FactSeeker, the SLPI's fact-checking arm, has been in operation, and we've been we've been monitoring both social media and mainstream media to verify information that go viral, both on these platforms, to provide the public, and we do fact-check information that we find are of public interest. So to give you an overview of the 2020 overall picture of what we have conducted during the past year, if you can see, we have identified 4 key points, or this is the major trend analysis during the past year. So in February, we have a significant high point of fake news, and we've identified mis and disinformation under 7 key points, 7 key criteria. And in February, the hike is on political and fake news, where information say about the Prime Minister resigning from his office and about the statements made by certain political parties or political personalities have been circulating on social media and on mainstream print. Then in April, we have another hike again on political related false information related to political personalities, political parties, and also false information regarding party decisions. Then during the month of August, there's a hike on society-related false information. This is also the time when the COVID pandemic was, where Sri Lanka experienced a second or third wave of the pandemic, and this was also the time when the teacher struggles in Sri Lanka took place. So we have false information related to those two incidents, and we have celebrities, false information regarding celebrity deaths and about COVID circulating during this period. Then in November, another hike we have again on celebrity deaths, then COVID-19 and other misinformation related to security footage regarding accidents. So this is the basic overview of 2020 as a fact-seeker engagement, and our areas are in the cyber spam, society, political news, economy news, health-related and environment-related news items. So engaging in fact-checking since 2020 August to this day, we fact-checked over 190 items, and we also understand the danger of false information or the spread of fake news, what we popularly call fake news. And we like to call this the Trojan effect of false information or disinformation. The reason why we use this term is that false information, most of the time, more often than not, is in the guise of real news, or is in the guise of good information or reliable information, and is spread in good faith. But oftentimes people are misled by this information, and this often lead to destruction and disruption of public interest and public well-being. So under having called this the Trojan effect of misinformation, we have also identified 7 areas for the purpose of this presentation for you to understand, also to show you how false information or the danger of false information ferments or infects several areas. First and foremost is it affects democracy and freedom of expression. So if you can see these 2 examples, we have conducted verifications. This is about a news circulating on social media, again a political personality, where he makes a statement about the Easter Sunday attacks, where he says, what's the matter with thousands of people dying? So this information is a manipulated statement, again designed in the guise of a newspaper article. So whoever consumes this information begins to think that, okay, a political person.
We can't hear you. Sorry to interrupt.
Hello.
Hello. Okay, now we can hear you. Okay, thanks.
Right. Okay. Right. So as I was saying, we have identified several sectors where the danger of false information ferments or infects the public decisions or public thinking. And the first one is under democracy and freedom of expression. So first example is of a political personality making a statement regarding the Easter Sunday attacks and people dying. And it is represented in the design of a newspaper article. The second is about the opposition party leader abstaining from voting at the Colombo Port City's Economic Commission when this is passed. So again, the idea of a democracy, especially when it's practiced in Sri Lanka, news items like this destroys or violates democracy and values of democracy. Secondly, we've identified health-related decisions where the danger of false information is trickled down to making decisions related to health, both at the national and individual level. We have a statement said to be made by Tilvin Silva saying that abstain from taking the Indian vaccine because it causes cholera infection. And then another unsettling information, again during the height of COVID-19, about oxygen cylinders running out in Kalubowila Base Hospital. Then again, another piece of information that was also in circulation on international media about a Nobel laureate saying that in 2 years' time, the COVID vaccine will kill people. Then thirdly, we've identified attitudes related to gender. Here, what is important is that most of the time, these news items do not really counter a fact, but this is directed to the gender, sexual orientation, or the fact that someone is female or male, or even of a different gender or sex. So here the first news item is about a photograph that says Mr. MP Gammanpila has taken his wife on a trip to visit to Iran, where the image is not of his wife, and it says Teltika Kinda Ganita Pardavakut Andua. So the image of the woman is reduced to a person who cannot make a decision for herself, and what she wears, what she does is decided by the man. The second is about a pregnant mother being infected with COVID-19, and the fact that she was infected was because she attended a party to celebrate the fact that celebrated the fact that she was with child. So next is inclusive governance, where we have identified false information disturbing or disrupting communal harmony and internal peace. We have this statement said to be made by MP Bhima Ratnayaka saying, if the Kartik court is banned for Muslims, then judicial council leadership for monks should also be withdrawn. The next is about the Pfizer vaccine, saying that it leads Sinhala Buddhist mothers to go sterile. So news like this disrupts inclusive governance or disturbs internal harmony. One of the other important area that we've identified through fact-checking is environmental activism. This was during environmental destruction was a hot topic in Sri Lanka, but we also saw a trend of social media engagement where significantly foreign images from different countries, like say Amazon or other rainforests, were posted saying that this is a picture from Sri Lanka, or say a location in Sri Lanka, and then also associating it to the governing party. So when the real need or the real activism around the environment activism was that people should be aware of these destructions, by creating a trend like this, the real purpose of environmental activism was defeated. And last, in 6th point, we've identified online security and cyber security. I'm sure most of you have been victims for this, where personal data and the personal information get infected or hacked, say through WhatsApp, Facebook, or other messaging. Then scientific thinking, another area that gets fermented is the ability to critically think or scientifically make decisions. Information like this, where people will not say engage in critical information consumption, like become able to make decisions scientifically, are examples here. So in this way, we've identified that the danger of this and misinformation also has effects to the news media industry, where the credibility of the news media industry is defeated by a way of increasingly defeating the purpose of news media products. And we are conscious about this fact as well. And we believe that this initiative also helps people consume or consume verified information, ensuring their right to accurate information. So FactSeek also operates on social media and web platforms. We also do fact check for you if you request us to conduct fact checks. These are web platforms and social media platforms. I'd like to end the presentation on behalf of SLPI here. Thank you.
Thank you for that detailed presentation and for showing us the areas that SLPI gets involved in fact-checking. Now we have our keynote speaker, who is a special guest. He will join online. He will be delivering the keynote for us. He is Bebers Osak. He is the director for International Fact-Checking Network. He's also, prior to International Fact-Checking Network, he has served as a founding executive director for a firm in Turkey engaging in fact-checking. So he has immense experience in this area. He has been working from 2014 in the area of fact-checking. So we would warmly welcome Bebers Osak to deliver the keynote at this time. Over to you, Bebers.
Hello, thank you so much. And I hope you can see me and hear me. And I apologize for my unusual appearance because I'm on a way to Norway for a conference, and I hope the connection is good, but I see the thumbs up. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here today with you for the International Fact-Checking Day celebrations organized by the Hashtag Generation in partnership with Verity Research and the Sri Lanka Press Institute. And I was able to meet with my colleagues from Verity Research and Sri Lanka Press Institute back in 2019 in Bangkok, Thailand. So I'm really proud and more than happy to see that those efforts have come to this point. I'm so happy. Founded back in late 2015, the International Fact-Checking Network, the IFCN, has been advocating for higher standards among the global fact-checking community. To fulfill that purpose, a code of principles for fact-checkers has been developed and introduced to the community in 2016. Code of Principles was immediately signed up by 35 organizations from 20 different countries after its launch in 2016. Facebook, now known as Meta, told the world that they would rely on their third-party fact-checking program in December 2016. That became a possible project after the fact-checking community wrote an open letter to Mark Zuckerberg in 2016 to address the need for fight against misinformation. In January 2017, we introduced a new system with independent and external assessors to review the adherence to the code and set up an advisory board to identify whether the applications qualify to become a verified signatory to our network. After a year of the launch, this application process turned into an online portal and became much more streamlined to help world's fact checkers. The IFCN currently has a pool of 181 assessors in 72 different countries. The International Fact-Checking Network puts a strong emphasis on the expertise, geographical coverage, and impartiality of its pool of external and independent assessors. We organize webinars for the assessors throughout the year to disseminate the know-how and experience which is essential for the assessments. The detailed and comprehensive guidelines for the assessors provide the people that are familiar with the work of the fact-checkers with a guidance on the interpretation of the code, as well as good examples and red flags to provide context. The code signatories range from big beasts of traditional media organizations, such as Le Monde Le Décodeur in France and the Washington Post in the US, to global news wires such as AFP, AP, DPA, and Reuters, to nonprofit organizations like Africa Check from South Africa, Full Fact from the UK, Checado from Argentina, and startups such as Agência Lupa in Brazil, PolitiFact in the US, and Rappler in the Philippines. As the list of signatures has grown, so has the diversity of news and political environments in which they work. Some operate in what are effectively one-party states and others in multi-party systems. In the last couple of years, not only has the global fact-checking community has grown, but the horizons of fact-checking, of the practice of fact-checking have grown as well. Today, compared to the mid-2010s, fact-checkers specialize and provide professional services in a variety of areas to some of the largest technology platforms. Google, Meta, Line, TikTok, WhatsApp, and YouTube are among the platforms that feature fact checks on their various products and services in different capacities. They range from surfacing fact checks to users, to work with fact checkers in professional and commercial capacities, to help the readers to have better context on the content they are consuming on those platforms. Fact checking is growing, but it's also evolving. The latest census that we have done identified 341 active fact-checking organizations, which is 50 up from last year's report. According to the very same survey, a large group of new fact-checking projects are based in Southeast Asia, making the region among the fastest growing regions for fact-checking organizations. But after years of steady and sometimes rapid growth, there are signs that the growth trend is slowing. And although misleading content and political lies have played a growing role in contentious elections and the global response to the coronavirus pandemic. Slightly more than 2 years ago, the world was shaken by the news of the novel coronavirus spreading around the world, followed by the first infodemic. As it was described by the United Nations, the infodemic created a new role for misinformation and generated the deadly impact of COVID-19. And it has been noted by observers, academics, and practitioners such as fact-checkers. Fact-checkers deal with countless baseless claims and conspiracy theories that are making people around the world more vulnerable to the disease. A study published in the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene estimated that about 6,000 people were admitted to hospitals as a result of false information on social media. The response to misinformation on COVID-19 has been far from being perfect. However, the consensus now we have on the need to tackle the issue with a multidisciplinary approach has set a new standard for collaboration between public institutions, technology platforms, fact-checkers, and broader industry experts seeking authoritative and reliable information. A recent study from the Reuters Institute found out that the number of English language fact checks rose by 900% just from January to March 2020. Technology companies have been under stronger scrutiny to address the impact of their business models on the amplification of misinformation to its highest level ever. Critics of big tech point out that shortcomings of platforms from an information quality perspective significantly different from what the previous focus was on their privacy and data protection concerns. International non-governmental organizations such as the United Nations are teaming up with fact-checkers to provide the most vulnerable people with accurate and digestible information. Politicians all around the world are under stronger emphasis for their lack of commitment to factual and scientifically backed information on the importance of social distancing, face coverings, and vaccinations for winning the battle against this pandemic. I can hear everybody asking, are these enough? It's absolutely far from being enough. Conspiracy theories still travel faster than reliable information. Vaccine hesitancy and accessibility still poses a strong risk against community immunity and is being fueled by disinformation circulating in closed groups, messaging apps, and social media, and even the traditional media. Scalability of fact-checking's impact has become the main theme for concern for fact-checkers across the board, and the lack of globally and consistently applied policies are making this fight harder. We believe that content moderation practices should be transparent, accountable, and empowered by experts, in this case, fact-checkers, to help the public to sort fiction from truth. We have a similar pattern we observe as fact-checkers during the war in Ukraine. The information war between the aggressor and the victim of a war is a clear indication of the importance of fact-checking and accurate information to provide the public with authoritative information during crisis time. Governments around the world are using the misinformation phenomenon as an opportunity to control the flow of information and public discourse at the expense of practices signaling censorship. More and more examples of government-controlled fact-checking operations compose a threat to the credibility that non-partisan and independent fact-checking organizations from South Africa to Norway, from the United States to Sri Lanka have earned over the years. Even in so-called established democracies, bad actors have weaponized fact-checking to deceive constituencies and marginalize dissidents that challenge their dominant narratives. Elections are growingly turning into information battlefields, where gatekeepers push narratives to populate the public domain and influence people's opinions. I come from a political fact-checking background. Between 2014 and 2019, the fact-checking organization that I launched and managed fact-checked 2 presidential, 3 parliamentarian, and one local election in my home country, Turkey. We had been asked numerous times whether our goal was to change people's decisions before elections. It was not. We were happy and fortunate that we were well connected with the international fact-checking community, even in our early days. Therefore, we never had aim to focus on changing people's decisions, as we were committed to nonpartisanship, and delivering false statements was not under anyone's monopoly. However, those elections enabled us, eventually fact-checking, to become a household name in the country as it now is around the world. Similar to roughly half of the fact-checking organizations in our network, the nonprofit nature of my former organization and the Verita Research formation was instrumental in communicating fact-checking as public interest journalism, as an antidote to polarizing discourse fueled by politically charged disinformation. Fact-checking today is at the intersection of accountability journalism and technology, serving the people through multi-layered publishing. We raise statements of politicians. We sometimes notarize the authenticity of all sorts of multimedia, and we put our credibility at stake while doing both. Health institutions and intergovernmental organizations have turned their eyes into fact-checkers to seek help in communicating factual information with people vulnerable to coronavirus misinformation. Authoritative and accurate information have become essential to address vaccine hesitancy and conspiracy theories targeting people's health. This crucial supply of factual information comes with a certain degree of commitment to excellence in reporting and trustworthiness of our mediums of supply as suppliers of such information. The relationship between fact-checking and technology is now more intertwined than ever given the growing demand in fact-checking by tech companies, which more or less act as our modern town halls for public discourse and connectivity. Freedom of speech and expression, as the most sacred values of our civilization as humankind, is questioned through the testing of freedom of reach on those platforms, and we intuitively resort to regulation as a means to filter out bad information. There is a golden opportunity in front of us as the advocates of accurate public discourse, since we have more reasons to be cautiously optimistic for the future of the internet. The understanding that misinformation can cause real-life harm has been established, and no credible objection has been raised against that. The acknowledgement of fact-checking as a public service is clearly represented in the increase of partnerships between fact-checkers and industry stakeholders, which are now at a record high. Technology around structured data provides new opportunities for fact-checkers to create sustainable business models to keep providing this public interest service in the years and decades ahead. As we transform into a growingly professionalizing cohort of fact-checking organizations, our responsibility to help the community to be stronger and sustainable. As the director of the International Fact-Checking Network, I thank you for organizing this gathering today to bring like-minded people of Sri Lanka to discuss these topics and surface bright ideas to tackle those challenges. I recognize that the stakes are higher in Sri Lanka, and fact-checking is an essential tool to hold the powerful to account and help the people to access better information. I strongly encourage everyone to honor nonpartisanship and transparency in these efforts, as fact-checking is supposed to be an added speech over the ongoing discourse, but one with a commitment to facts and accuracy. Wishing you all the best in your journey as fact-checkers in the region, and celebrate your International Fact-Checking Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Osak, for sharing your experience and insights with us. Also, thank you for dedicating your time and joining with us and accepting our invitation. We really appreciate it. Thank you once again. Okay, now we go into a time of panel discussion. We are done with the presentations for the day. So I would now call upon the panelists. We have 3 panelists with us here physically, and we have 1 panelist who will join online. So we have with us this evening, Dr. Gehan Gunatilaka. He is an attorney at law, also the senior partner at Lex AG. So we are really glad to have you here, Dr. Gehan. We also have Dilrukshi Handanetti, who is a senior journalist who has been helping us with various events. She is also the Executive Director of Center for Investigating Reporting. Also, she's a co-convener of South Asia Women in Media. We have with us Lakna Pranamana. Lakna is a fact checker Sri Lanka Bureau FP. She is also an experienced journalist who has experience over 15 years in journalism. We have Kasun Kumarage, who will be joining us online. Kasun Kumarage is a social communications specialist who is attached to Sri Lanka Press Institute. He's also the team lead for the Sri Lankan Press Institute fact-checking unit. So over to the panel. Looking forward for a fruitful discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have to reach out to medical officers or the government officials, different people. And we are in a situation where there's a crisis, ongoing crisis in a European state and also within the country, and also last 2 to 3 years where we have faced a pandemic. And when we look at the current context, we have seen a lot of disinformation throughout the last 2 years within the country where we have faced the pandemic, and also that disinformation threatened the decision making of people where that tend to, we have seen during the presidential election and then the parliamentary election. And also we have seen now there are ongoing protests where a lot of disinformation going through, where there's people come and say different stuff, different things. Politicians, the ministers are saying different stories about the incident, where there's a lot of stories coming out. Dr. Gehan, we'll start with you. We'll go in the first round as initial remarks from everyone, and then we go in. You tweeted with saying that the government has, or the disinformation machine has started. We'll start from that.
Thanks, Arshana. Thanks for inviting me. And in this sort of disinformation landscape, right? So there's disinformation that ordinary users can produce. There's disinformation that media institutions can produce. And then there's, of course, disinformation that can be produced by state institutions and state actors. And I think it's important to try and understand the various factors that go into disinformation. And one way of understanding that is to think about it as a chain. So in a disinformation chain, you would start with the instigators, the people who actually come up with the disinformation. These are the sources of disinformation. Then you have the agents of disinformation, the people who actually take the information and spread that false narrative. Sometimes they may do it deliberately and sometimes they may do it inadvertently. So I'll come back to that point. Then you have the actual message. So there has to be some viral sort of content or viral feature to that message for it to really catch on and become disinformation. Information that no one really cares about or would immediately assume is false would not become disinformation. There has to be something, viral and potent about the message. Then you have the intermediaries. The platforms have to be, there for the information to flow. So the channels are also an important part of the chain. And finally, you have the targets, us, users, readers, audience, people who end up getting fooled by disinformation and could end up being agents of disinformation as well. So there's a little bit of a loop that goes on. So this morning, we have a classic example, which I want to talk about very briefly, of where the disinformation source is the government, very clearly. The characterization of yesterday's protest as somehow being instigated by extremists. Anyone who was following the news can see that that's a misconceived, mischievous characterization. In fact, I recently saw the minister in charge of public security now coming out and contesting that characterization and saying the extremists were not behind it after all. So this came out from an official source. That's the instigator. Then you had journalists, so you can call them journalists, reporters, whatever you want to call them, uncritically becoming agents of disinformation. Quote. So if you take a piece of disinformation and say, so-and-so actually said it, and then you report it as news, you can wash your hands of it and say, no, that person said it, so I'm quoting, that's all I'm doing. But then you become an agent of disinformation. And what's dangerous is you have legitimacy in society. So therefore you become a very effective agent of disinformation. And I think this is where there needs to be some strategy that goes beyond targeting the message and the final targets, the users, and also looking at who's responsible for spreading disinformation. So if you look at the disinformation chain, the typical strategies would be to target the message. And then, of course, through digital literacy and media literacy, you target the user. And to some extent, through accountability, you target the instigator. And that's what a lot of fact checks actually do. They call out the politician for spreading disinformation, for starting it. But I wonder whether more work has to be done in terms of the agents of disinformation. And I draw a distinction between instigator and agent, and the more recent studies do this, because the agent is not the instigator. This is the person who carries with them some kind of legitimacy in society. It could be another official having a particular position within the government structure. It could be a journalist, it could be a lawyer who goes around taking that disinformation and uncritically spreading it. And I think the next frontier for this sort of fact-checking strategy needs to account for this as well and work closely with independent journalism and the sort of work doing to inculcate accountability, not only amongst instigators, but also amongst agents. So I'm going to pause there.
Thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Lakna, you have been a journalist and now a fact checker at International Bureau. So we'll continue where Doctor stopped at being an independent journalist, and also fact checkers have to do more.
Yeah, I would agree with Gehan, and of course, but like he said, what Dilruksh is doing is important in that sense. Of course, fact checkers are only human, so there's only so much that they can handle when they are debunking a claim. And also there are certain restrictions that apply to fact checkers when we are trying to tackle a claim. For example, if it was really vague, or if there was sarcasm involved and not a direct claim, we cannot step into that arena where we would interpret a certain statement for somebody, because that then borders on curtailing somebody's freedom of expression, because they could always turn around and say that is not what I meant. So it's a very it's a blurred line sometimes, and the role of a fact checker is very it's like sometimes very sort of, you have to be very careful, because everything that we do has to be transparent, and eventually what we do is for the benefit of the general public. So yes, more has to be done, but it is in this case that things like media literacy, having the general public more involved in verifying a claim, fact checking. And sometimes it's not a matter of, going through an entire process of debunking something, but just to be careful and to be wary when you see something online, you take a second look at it. Could this be true? If you're unsure, what you should do is to not forward it saying sharing as received, or I haven't verified the information, but I'm sharing it anyway. If you haven't verified, just don't share it. Like, we have to all have that discipline, whether you're a journalist or, somebody just surfing online. We have to inculcate that discipline within ourselves. So that is important as well. And of course, like Gehan said, and this is where things like media literacy and raising more awareness on the importance of fact checking comes into play, and especially in places like Sri Lanka, even among the journalists, because we are so used to, like, sometimes our journalists, it comes with deadlines, having to deal with all of the pressures in the newsroom. Sometimes there's just no time for them to fact check, but that is not an excuse to not verify something that's been said. That is very, very important. And that's, I think fact checking is one of the basic tenets of journalism. So it's a collaborative effort.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So you end up with a point saying that fact checkers or the journalists have deadlines, and they can't say that because of the deadline we put this. So I move on to Devrukshi say about this. So people work on daily basis. People have deadlines. If you look at the last night incident, maybe the newspapers will print at 12 a.m. So they don't have figure out something. We'll start there.
So I'll like to take a cue from what Gehan said, as well as what Lakna said. When you're a journalist, you have absolute responsibility to convey truth, and that is not truth that appears, as a truth to you personally. You have to verify it, because that's built in. There is no question about, that is right. There are deadlines, but having deadlines does not mean that you can always work around the truth, give half-baked stories. And this is also why I would like to say that the media industry, as an industry, we are not trusted anymore. So this whole trust deficit has come about because people know that journalists are no longer verifying information to the extent that they should be doing. A classic example, there was a very recent story about the kind of public wealth that certain politicians are having, and this gets tweeted about. There are shared posts, but nobody goes. People actually do stories around it, write critiques on it, do commentaries on it, but nobody really tries to find out whether this claim is true. Actually somebody amassed this kind of wealth through a particular venture. So when you leave people in that kind of suspense where information is such a blur, or the lack of it, you're really not doing your job right. And we have been reporters for a long time. Lakna and I have worked even in the same newsroom. So we all know that no matter what, verifying is so essential that you just cannot say that I ran into a deadline and sorry, I had no time. For example, whether it was an extremist or it was, badly introduced word, and whether I can use that word quoting somebody and pass on that responsibility, saying that, oh, sorry, it came from a responsible place. Responsible persons, there are spokespersons for organizations. They're supposed to be telling us the truth. But we also know the other side, or the downside, is that they will be presenting information that is beneficial to them. There will always be an angle to it. So if you get information from that kind of source, you definitely have the responsibility to go and verify that. I also believe that the newsrooms cannot say that we do not have fact checkers. Sorry, things have changed. This game has changed a lot. Newsrooms elsewhere in South Asia, they are having fact checkers, little units, individuals who are trained to verify. Why? Because given the infodemic, because of the fact that there is so much of fake information that's circulating, it's no longer possible for a newsroom to handle this, deadlines notwithstanding. So you need to have basic training, basic understanding of information literacy, be able to use digital tools, also use that other thing that we don't seem to be using, and which is called common sense. Like, there is a common sense approach to it as well. if something does not gel well. And if there was a context to that introduction of the word extremist, we are definitely duly bound to check why that word is getting mainstreamed. And are we going to be the people who are just mainstreaming it because it was somewhere there? And the other point I want to make is we also have to broad-based fact-checking, because fact-checkers can't be everywhere. They can't be doing this every day. We have a few fact-checking organizations here, and there is so much of misinformation. The volume is enormous, and everything is so important to the public, the kind of information. So what you need to do is you also have to, as Lakna said, create spaces for more information literacy among people, because they also need to be able to see, because all of us are not going to use digital tools and run around saying, okay, let me see whether this image is, really the authentic one, but that's not the case. But we all have to have some basic understanding as to what information literacy is and practice it. And in the coming days, this is going to be really critically important.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kasun is joining with us online. කසුන් මම දිල්රුක්ෂි නවත්තපු තැනින් පටන් ගන්න කැමතියි. අපිට ගොඩාක් දුස්තොරතුරු තියෙනවා. අපිට එක දිගට තොරතුරු එනවා. හැබැයි අපේ ජර්නලිස්ට්ලාට වගේ ඩෙඩ්ලයින් ප්‍රශ්නයක් නැහැ. නමුත් අපි ඉක්මනට මේක පබ්ලිෂ් කරන්න ඕන. නැත්නම් මේකෙන් වෙන හානිය වැඩි. මොකද අපි සමහරවිට ෆැක්ට් චෙක් කරන්න යන කාලය වැඩි. හැබැයි මේ බොරුවට වචන දෙක තුනයි තියෙන්නේ. මේ අභියෝගය කොහොමද දකින්නේ? මොකද්ද මේකට දෙන්න පුළුවන් විසඳුම?
Thank you, Harshana. මුලින්ම මම පොඩි කාලයක් අරගෙන මේ මුලින්ම පොඩි අගය කිරීමක් ඒ වගේම ස්තුති කිරීමක් කරන්න කැමතියි මේ වැඩේ අපි සංවිධානය කිරීම ගැන. මොකද අපි තනිව කටයුතු කරනවාට වඩා මම හිතනවා මේ වගේ මේ ශාස්ත්‍රයේ නියැලිලා ඉන්න අය එකතු වෙලා මේ වගේ සාකච්ඡාවක් ආරම්භ කරන එක ඉතාම වැදගත් කියලා. අනිත් කාරණේ තමයි මම හිතනවා අද වගේ දවසක විශේෂයෙන්ම අප්‍රේල් 1 වෙනිදා වගේ දවසක මේ වගේ කරුණක් කතා කරන්න ලැබීම එක විදිහකට හොඳ ආරම්භයක්. මොකද අපි දන්නවා මේක මේ දුස්තොරතුරු ඒ වගේම වැරදි තොරතුරු මේ අසත්‍ය තොරතුරු ගැන කතා කරද්දී අපිට සිද්ධ වෙලා තියෙනවා මේ නිරන්තරයෙන් මේ ගැන අවධානයෙන් ඉන්න. ඒ කියන්නේ හැම දවසක්ම අද වගේ තමයි අපිට ඉන්න සිද්ධ වෙලා තියෙන්නේ. ඉතින් ඒකත් එක්ක මම අපි කතා කරගෙන ආපු දෙයට එකතු කරන්න කැමතියි. ඇත්තටම ඔව් මම කලින් කියපු පැනලිස්ට්ලාගේ කතාවලටත් එකඟ වෙන ගමම නමුත් මම කියන්න කැමතියි මේකටත් අපිට ලක්නත් කිව්වා ලිමිටඩ් ටයිම් ෆ්‍රේම් එකක් තියෙන කියන එක. ඒක විදිහකින් මොකද ඇත්ත තොරතුරක් එන්න පරක්කු වුණාට ඒක ගැන ඇත්ත තොරතුරක් එන්න පරක්කු වුණාට ඒක සමාජයට බලපෑම ගොඩක් අඩු වෙන්න පුළුවන්. අසත්‍ය තොරතුරක් ඒක සත්‍යාපනය කළා මේක අසත්‍යයි කියලා කියන පරක්කු වුණොත් ගොඩක් වෙලාවට ඒක වෙන හානිය ඊටාම වැඩි. ඉතින් අපිට සිද්ධ වෙනවා පුළුවන් තරම් ඉක්මනින් මේ ඒ අදාළ කාරණය සත්‍යාපනය කරලා එහෙම නැත්නම් වැරද්ද නිවැරදි කරලා එක විදියකින් ඉදිරිපත් කරන්න. ඉතින් ඒකෙදි දැන් අපිට විශාල ගැටලුවක් වෙන්නේ මේක හැමතිස්සෙම මේක ආందోලනාත්මක කාරණයක්. ඒක සරල කාරණයක් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. මොකද සත්‍ය විකෘති වෙලා තියෙන්න පුළුවන්, සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම නොමග යවලා තියෙන්න පුළුවන්. නැත්තම් අලුත් විදිහක නිර්මාණය කරපු තොරතුරක් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඉතින් මේ කාරණා මොක වුණත් අපිට සිද්ධ වෙනවා ටිකක් කරුණු එකින් එක අරගෙන යම්කිසි වෙලාවක් ගත කරලා ඒක සත්‍යාපනය කරගන්න. ඉතින් ඒකට ගත වෙන කාලය විශේෂයෙන්ම දැන් මේ අසත්‍ය තොරතුරු සම්බන්ධව කටයුතු කරද්දී තියෙන ගැටලුවක් තමයි අපිට අසත්‍ය තොරතුරු එන තැනින් සහ ඒක අවසාන වශයෙන්ම කොහෙන්ද අපි වෙරිෆයි කරගන්නේ කියලා ගත්තට පස්සේ ඒ වෙරිෆයි කරගන්න තියෙන ඒ තොරතුරු දරන කෙනා, තොරතුරු දරන ස්ථානය, එහෙම නැත්නම් ඔතොරිටි එක ඒ තොරතුරු දීම සීමා කරලා තිබුණොත් ඒ තොරතුරු වලට ඇක්සස් වෙන්න අපිට බැරි වුණොත් සමහරවිට විශාල කාලයක් යනවා. ඒක තමයි විශාල ගැටලුවක් අපිට මුහුණ දීලා තියෙන මේ වෙලාවේ. පබ්ලික්ලි තොරතුරු නැතිකම සහ තොරතුරු තියෙන අවසාන පුද්ගලයා හෝ අධිකාරිය ඒ තොරතුරු සීමා කිරීම හෝ අවසන් කිරීම. ඉතින් ඒකත් එක්ක අපි හැමෝටම තියෙන අභියෝගයක් තමයි මේ වෙලාව කියන එක. ඉතින් ඒක අපිට ජය ගන්න ඒකට අපිට ඇඩ්‍රස් කරන්න වෙන්නේ තොරතුරු ඉක්මනින් ලබා දීම සම්බන්ධව කතිකාවතක් ඇති කරගන්නේ. ඒ කියන්නේ ඕනෑම තොරතුරක් කොහොමද publicly available තොරතුරු විදියට ලබා දීලා දැනටමත් තියන්නේ. ඒ කියන්නේ අපි හොයන්නේ යනකොටම ඒ තොරතුර දැනටමත් එළියේ තියෙනවා නම් අපිට පුළුවන් ඉතා පහසුවෙන් ඒ තොරතුරට ඇක්සස් වෙන්න. දැන් උදාහරණයක් විදිහට පහුගිය දිනවල හැම භාණ්ඩයක්ම මිල ගණන් වැඩි වුණා. එතකොට මිල ගණන් වැඩි වෙද්දී අපිට තියෙනවා නම් එක තැනක් මේ මිල ගණන් වල අවසාන මිල ගණන මෙන්න මෙතන තමයි සටහන් වෙලා තියෙන්නේ. මෙන්න මෙතන තමයි සිමෙන්ති වල අවසාන මිල මෙන්න මෙතන තමයි තියෙන්නේ කියලා කියන්න. බලන්න පුළුවන් නම් පාරිභෝගික අධිකාරිය හරි මුදල් අමාත්‍යාංශය හරි ස්ථානය අපිට පුළුවන් එතනින් ඒ තොරතුර ලබා ගන්න. ඉතින් අපිට ඒක මැනුවලි හොයන්න ගියොත් ඒකට යන කාලය මම හිතනවා ඒ ආයතන පද්ධතිය ඇතුලේ ඒ සම්බන්ධ කරගන්න යන වෙලාවත් එක්ක දීර්ඝ කාලයක් යයි කියලා. ඒකට ඒ වගේ අපිට අපිට යෝජනා කරන්න පුළුවන් වෙන්නේ තොරතුරු හැකිතරම් නිරාවරණය කරලා තියන්න කියලා අදාළ අධිකාරි වලින් යම්කිසි ඉල්ලීමක් ඒ ගැන සාකච්ඡාවක් ගොඩනගලා තියෙන එක තමයි කියලා තමයි මම හිතන්නේ. ස්තුතියි හර්ෂ.
Kasun. So I'll take a point from Kasun where we have to reach out to the people who sometimes spread the disinformation, maybe the public officials, maybe the government, maybe the political authority. So Doctor, you always talk about state-sponsored disinformation or the mechanisms or the machines or their propaganda. So when fact checkers have to reach out to sometimes they say something, but we have to quote it. We even doubt about it. So how fact checking will be successful in that process?
Thanks, Harshada. I want to echo something that Kasun said, that this is actually a very important discussion that we're having, because we're bringing different entities that engage in fact checking into one discussion. And I think the only way to deal with disinformation in Sri Lanka is for us to put our heads together. And I think Lakna also mentioned that you can't have fact checkers do everything. It's an uphill battle, because we all know that the research confirms that disinformation travels faster than the truth. So getting our heads together and figuring out who does what in terms of tackling various links in this disinformation chain is actually important. So there may be organizations that focus on the message and contest the message through counter messaging. There'll be organizations that work on driving accountability. Like many of Verity's fact checks are focused on politicians and public officials, and therefore you drive accountability and you make it costly for an official to actually start disinformation, because they're open to embarrassment and criticism, and that's the only way you really get people to think twice before spreading it. Then there are organizations that are also working on the intermediaries, engaging tech companies. I mean, Factum has just launched a sort of process to try and build a code of conduct for tech companies. I think this is really important. And then you're tackling that element of the link. So the question I had was, who's dealing with the agents? And I think that's a really tough one, because it takes a lot of work in the journalism field and in broader sort of accountability across officials to make it costly for them to quote disinformation. It's not the same, because all you're doing is quoting someone else. So if society doesn't hold you to account for that, I mean, there's really no incentive to stop that, because at the end of the day, a lot of journalists that I speak to about why they do what they do, they say they need to break the story, right? If I don't break the story, someone else will break the story. And that's the incentive structure. So I don't have a good answer to that problem. And I think that's where I would say in all the links, we need to figure out how to deal with that.
Thank you, Dr. Gehan. So you mentioned about working together. So Lakna comes from an international bureau which do fact check all over the world and who have journalists all over the world in different places. And we have, even I have reached you personally on certain stuff that was shared in online platforms in different languages, but now translated into Sinhala. So what collaborative work can be done to mitigate this threat?
So Harshana, if I talk about AFP in itself, you mentioned the fact that we notice disinformation and misinformation that circulates globally, which are then trickled into local social media platforms. We see the same thing in our fact checking, the kind of claims that we come across. So AFP has one of the largest fact checking networks in the world. So when we have some of the fact checks that we do are, they have a global reach sort of relevance. So then we do work with other bureaus, and we have the upper hand in that sense because we can reach out to our bureaus and the journalists in those bureaus to be able to, fact check a claim or a story or verify a picture, sometimes an image. In terms of working with organizations locally, of course, we reach out to each other on a personal capacity to ask, do you have a contact for this source, or what do you think of this story? Do you have any idea? Sometimes when it's very vague, how do you think we should tackle it, sort of thing. But there's no, there's a lack of an sort of official or even sort of a formal mechanism for the fact-checking organizations to come together. And it can even be journalists from mainstream media institutions who are not fact-checkers per se, who are interested in it, who could join it, which it would definitely benefit each and every media organization. So there just has to be interest to build that kind of collaboration or, setting.
Thank you. When we talk about collaboration and also talking about journalistic work, this disinformation comes because of the irresponsible journalism as well, or the maybe they are, or the media also kind of spreading misinformation or the disinformation, or the credible media. So what do you think as the journalists to do? What's their role in it? What's their responsibility in it?
I think there's a primary role for every journalist, and that is to verify information. That hasn't changed. What has changed is the moment, the swiftness with which information changes, and how it gets muddied because of all these, number of players who are seeking that space and muddying waters for all of us. And the audiences are really getting confused and misled. Sometimes the cost can be really terrible. So Gehan said something about breaking the story. They do break the story sometimes, right? Break in that real sense. You are really running to be the first person to break that story, but what you're actually doing is destroying the story. So that is happening. I think newsrooms have a serious problem that they have to address. Formal newsrooms to informal newsrooms. And what's the problem with the formal newsrooms? Would be that we are talking about political players and how they, how they do introduce propaganda, right? And we are just sitting ducks for that kind of thing. What about the media houses? What about the ownership models? What about the investments of politicians and political parties? So how this is one of the, I think this is one of the biggest issues that we really have to tackle right now, because political propaganda does come out of media houses. And it's just not politicians or political organizations or interest groups. So the media houses have become interest groups, watching the politicians' interests. So this also calls, like, just as we talk about collaboration, it's really a difficult question also. They themselves must understand that as an industry, we are no longer trusted. We are losing our market space. When you lose trust, you definitely lose your market space because you're losing your value and you have nothing to offer to the community. If that is happening, the community of practitioners, the journalists, the organizations, media heads must put their heads together and see why it is happening, what is in our interest. But I don't think the media ownership is also interested in that. So there lies a problem, as bad as the politicians, because they are beneficiaries from this kind of corrupt political system. They do not want to bear the cat. And that's number one. And second thing, individual journalists. Individually, how much can we do in newsrooms? And I'm talking about the formal mainstream newsrooms, because there are also alternate newsrooms. The alternate newsrooms, Gehan and I were having this little chat before we had this, had this formal interaction. Who is a journalist? Who can actually responsibly place information in the public domain? We do know the so-called, tagged journalist with that information department ID is supposed to be a journalist. They make a hell of a lot of mistakes. They mislead the public. But also there are others who have never had any formal training about news gathering and dissemination. And that's a serious problem. And you have them in the thousands. So we have two sets of people at least. Those who come from the formalized, more mainstream kind of mechanism, and those who are out there. But they're all pushing information out. And we do not know how to verify, how to check, who's telling us the truth. So I think there has to be, even on online platforms and news platforms, you have to have some agreement on the basics of what kind of information and what is the criteria for placing information in the public domain, because we expect people to trust our information. And the same goes for the mainstream newsrooms, and the media leaders have a huge role to play in that. So collaborations of that sort is also necessary for people to, we are just placed. Why do we do? Lakshman was talking about fact checking. You fact check in the public, something of public importance because it matters. And the newspapers, the television stations, who have now become propagandists, many of them, for different political parties, for the governments that come and go, they also must really, have some inward thinking and really reflect upon their role and responsibility without just blaming each other.
Kasun, අපි කතා කරා අපේ ජනමාධ්‍ය ගැන. අපි දැක්ක ෆැක්ට් සීක් එකනොත් ගොඩක් කරලා තිබ්බ ෆැක්ට් චෙකින් විවිධ වෙබ් අඩවි පුවත්පත් මෙතනදී තියෙන අභියෝගය කොහොමද මේ සමහර පිළිගත් මාධ්‍ය ආයතන පිළිගත් වෙබ් අඩවි මේ වල වැරදි ප්‍රවෘත්ති කරුණු පරීක්ෂා කරන අපි දිල්රුක්ෂි උනත් කතා කරා මේක ගැන මේ අභියෝගය කොහොමද දකින්නේ?
ඒක විශේෂයෙන්ම මේන්ස්ට්‍රීම් මීඩියා ගැන ගත්තොත් මේන්ස්ට්‍රීම් මීඩියා වල දැන් අපි දකිනවා යනවා අසත්‍ය තොරතුරු, නමුත් ඒක යන පැටර්න් එක ගොඩක් වෙලාවට ටිකක් වෙනස්. මම හිතන්නේ ෆැක්ට් චෙකින් කරන අයටත් සමහර වෙලාවට ඒක ටැකල් කරන්න ටිකක් අමාරු අවස්ථා තියෙනවා. දැන් උදාහරණයක් විදිහට මොකක් හරි සිදුවීමක් සම්බන්ධව දැන් අපි දන්නවා මාධ්‍ය ඇතුලේ තියෙනවා මාධ්‍යට තොරතුරු ඉදිරිපත් කරන අතරේ එයාලගේ තව ෆීචර්ස්. උදාහරණයක් විදිහට අපි ස්ටෝරි ටෙලිං ගැන කතා කරොත් ඒකේ කියන විලාසය ක්‍රමය වෙනස් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. එතකොට ඒ ක්‍රමයත් එක්ක සමහරලාට අපිට තියෙන අත්දැකීම තමයි ක්‍රමය ඇතුලේ දැන් අපි හිතමු කාගේ හරි උපුටනයක් දක්වනවා, මෙන්න මේ කෙනා මේ ගැන දක්වපු අදහස කොහොමද කියන එක ගැන. එතකොට ඒක උපුටනයක් වුණත් ඒක ඇතුලේ යම්කිසි තොරතුරු තියෙන්න පුළුවන් යම්කිසි සිදුවීමක් හෝ දෙයක් ගැන. ඉතින් ඒ වගේ අවස්ථාවක අපිට ඩිරෙක්ට් ඇඩ්‍රස් කරන්න බෑ මාධ්‍ය ආයතනය කොහොමද අපි මේ ඇයි මේක මෙහෙම ලියලා තියෙන්නේ කියලා. මොකද ඒක අදාළ පුද්ගලයෙක් එක්ක කරන ලද ඉන්ටර්විව් එකක් වෙන්න පුළුවන්, එයාගෙන් ලබා ගන්නපු අදහසක් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඉතින් එතකොට අපිට ඇඩ්‍රස් කරන්න වෙන්නේ සමහර වෙලාවට වාර්තාකරුවා විසින් වාර්තා කරලා තියෙන මුල් සිදුවීම. එතකොට මුල් සිදුවීම ගත්තම මුල් සිදුවීම සමහර වෙලාවට ඔෆිෂියල් කෙනෙක් නොවෙන්න පුළුවන්. අපි උදාහරණයක් විදිහට බෙහෙතක් කියලා කියමු. අපි COVID-19 ගැන කතා කරපු පහුගිය දවස්වල. ඒකට විවිධ අය අපි මෙහෙම බෙහෙතක් හැදුවා කියලා වගේ එනවා. ඒ වගේ තොරතුරු අපිට එනවා. එතකොට තොරතුරු එන්නේ පුවත්පත හෝ මාධ්‍ය ආයතනයේ මේන්ස්ට්‍රීම් මීඩියා ඩිජිටල් මේ රූපවාහිනිය හෝ ප්‍රවෘත්ති මේ ගුවන්විදුලි යන මාධ්‍ය වලින් විතරක් නෙමෙයි. මොකද ඒක කියලා තියෙන වෙනත් කෙනෙක්. එතකොට අපිට ඇඩ්‍රස් කරන්න වෙනවා සමහර ලාවට ඒ කියපු මුල් කෙනා. එතකොට ඒ වගේ වෙලාවලදී එයා ඔෆිෂියල් මට්ටමේ ඒ කියන්නේ අපි දැන් රජයේ ආයතනයක නම් දැන් සෞඛ්‍ය සම්බන්ධ ගැටලුවක් නම් අපිට වසංගත රෝග විද්‍යා ආයතනයෙන් හරි සෞඛ්‍ය අමාත්‍යාංශයෙන් හරි අහන්න පුළුවන්. නමුත් එයා සාමාන්‍ය පුද්ගලයෙක් නම් සමහරවිට අපිට ගැටලු සහගත තත්ත්වයක් වෙනවා. ඒ තොරතුරු ගැන දන්න දත්ත තියෙන්නේ ඔක්කොම යාගාව විතරයි. ඉතින් අපිට ඒ වගේ ගැටලු සහගත අවස්ථා හම්බ වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඉතින් අපි කරන්නේ බොහෝ වෙලාවට මේක අපි මේ පැත්තෙන් කරුණු පරීක්ෂා කිරීම කරන ගමන්ම අනිත් පැත්තෙන් මේ තොරතුරු සහ තොරතුරු වල මතයන් විදියට තියෙන තොරතුරු මොනවාද? ඊට පස්සේ ඒක ඇතුලේ තියෙන කරුණු විදියට තියෙන තොරතුරු මොනවාද කියලා පොඩි වෙන් කර ගැනීමක් කරන්න විශේෂයෙන්ම ග්‍රාහකයාගේ පැත්තෙන් යම් යම් දැනුවත් කිරීම වල අපි නිරත වෙලා ඉන්නවා. ඉතින් ඒ වගේ පැත්තෙන් මම හිතනවා මේ වගේ දේවල් ටිකක් අපිට පුළුවන් වෙයි හදාගන්න. අනිත් කාරණය මාධ්‍ය ආයතන වලින් ගත්තත් අපි උත්සාහ කරනවා විවිධ දැනුවත් කිරීම විවිධ වැඩසටහන් එක්ක මාධ්‍ය වේදීන් සම්බන්ධ කරගෙන මේ ගැන කටයුතු කරන්න. ඒ වගේ අංශ වලින් තමයි අපිට තියෙන අත්දැකීම මේ ගැන කියන්න තියෙන්නේ.
බොහොම ස්තුතියි කසො. So I'll come with two questions, Doctor, and this will be the final round as well, where you talked about FactTime joining with the platforms. So in platforms, we have seen, even though the fact checkers have verified that these are false news or the disinformation, we continue to see that. So what is their responsibility? And the other question is, Kasun also mentioned about we have to reach out to people. Sometimes all those information has within one person, maybe the government. And also we have seen during the COVID or even this pandemic, we have seen doctors itself promote certain medicines, certain cures. And also we have seen people are supporting, for example, anti-vaccine campaigns or vaccine hesitance. How can we face this challenge?
I don't have a good answer to either of those questions, unfortunately. I think the engagement with tech companies is crucial, and that is happening particularly in a context where a lot of tech companies have been criticized for not doing enough to moderate content on their platforms, right? And in the context of Sri Lanka and Myanmar, we had not only disinformation, but also hate speech mixed with disinformation as a serious problem. And there were inquiries and pieces of research that was actually done to assess the role of tech companies, not in actually actively spreading the disinformation as if they are instigators of disinformation, but not doing enough to prevent it, and also questionably even benefiting from the disinformation in terms of revenue structures. So all of that is a domain that requires engagement. And I think it's a mistake to probably put all tech companies in the same basket, right? I think some tech companies have made progress, others have been slow to respond. And I think what we're learning as we sort of become more experienced in this domain is that we need to also have specific strategies for different tech companies. And I think a overarching code of conduct is a good idea. And this is obviously a non-state initiative. And the response of tech companies will be interesting, because I think tech companies have already shown some interest in collaborating and sort of cooperating with this initiative. So I'm sort of cautiously optimistic. On your second question, I mean, this is the problem. The research across a variety of countries shows us that fact-checking is very good when it comes to contesting misinformation and disinformation and creating knowledge, but it does not change beliefs. And the research is very clear on that. If you want to change beliefs, you can't rely purely on fact-checking. That's a struggle that requires a lot more effort politically, the education front. I mean, sociologically, there are lots of things that need to be done. So if someone wants to believe that vaccines don't work because of a preconceived notion, some kind of bias they already have, they will pick that fact or pick that falsehood to confirm their biases. So it's called motivated reasoning, and there's a little bit of scholarship on that. So I think that's why disinformation is so potent, because people actually pick the stuff that confirm their biases. So if you contest it with facts, not everyone is going to change their biases. They'll just ignore the facts and then continue along. And the examples of, elections in the US, elections in France in 2017, particularly around statistics on immigration, it showed that even with fact checking, people still voted for the right-wing politicians that peddled those false statistics. So I think we need to also know the limitations of fact checking and combine it with other initiatives that deal with some of those biases.
So one last question, Dr. You mentioned about hate speech, and also in the Veritas presentation, they also mentioned about prejudices or maybe the blame game. When it comes to hate speech, we have seen ethnicities, religions are related, and also this information targeted people's emotions. What can we do about that?
Again, I don't think fact checking is going to deal with prejudices. They will reveal prejudices. They'll reveal the trends that I think Mahoshadi spoke about, that you see these prejudices emerging. But fact checking alone is not going to do that, because some of these prejudices are much more deep or deeply entrenched in society. And without a much broader transformative project, you're not going to deal with those prejudices. So I think it's important to do fact checking, because you can stem the flow of disinformation and hate speech, but hate flows from, deeper rooted problems with, people believing that countries belong to them, these entitlement complexes, having all these phobias, having exceptional status in society. All these things are much deeper drivers of prejudice. And I think that while fact checking is important to drive the process of fighting this off and revealing it, it's not going to necessarily address those deep cleavages.
Thank you, Doctor. So Lakna, I come to you as a practitioner of fact checking or a practical person on that. So we ask ordinary people to do not share this or check this, verify this. But every person in the time or in this period doesn't have that time to do that. I mean, even we saw it last night or the previous days, people sharing, but that even though we say don't share, people do share. And also sharing has two things where people get to know the information, maybe the verified information, also sharing. So when we stop them, so they will also stop that flow as well. And as fact checkers, we say to stop the flow, don't share. So how can an ordinary citizen do a fact check in a quick time? What's your advice to the general public?
So unfortunately, there's no one size fits all answer, Harshana, because the type and the patterns of disinformation and misinformation that we saw possibly like even a year ago is not what we see now. People like those with vested interests, those who circulate disinformation, they've got more sophisticated. They've understood how fact checks work, and they try to sort of work through those loopholes. So that is why I say there's no one size fits all, but there are general rules that you can apply. For example, if a claim looks overly exaggerated or too good to be true, always take a step back and do a little bit of digging. If it's an image, now with your mobile phones, you can just do a reverse image search, and most of the time it works. Of course, if the image doesn't have a digital footprint, then you have to dig deeper, but then that's when the don't share rule apply. And then if you're sharing an article, sometimes it's not the article in itself, but it's the headline that's misleading. So every time before you share an article, please go through the article and read it, perhaps like the first few paras, and you'd be able to see whether or not the body reflects what the headline reads. And the other thing is, it's very important to get information from credible sources. If it's an international news agency with a lot of credibility, you would notice that there are no grammar errors or factual errors, because they do run their stories through fact checkers. I wish I could say the same about local media, but hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll get there one day. But like I said, it's very important to share news if you must share from a credible source, so that the probability of that being misleading or partially true or something is less. So it's little bits of practices here and there like that. But yeah, you always have to keep a lookout, because if you're going to think of a set of rules and think if they fit these criteria, then it must be true. If they don't, then it's not true. That's one surefire way to fall prey to misinformation and disinformation.
Thank you. Thank you, Nala. So, what do you, Dilrukshi? Where journalists and the credible journalism can ease the burden on fact checkers? What's your advice to the budding journalists and also the media institutions on this, or to take informed decisions? Because in Sri Lanka, media plays a bigger role, and they have to play a bigger role than what they are doing now.
I guess it's really up to the media institutions to come together and really have, some kind of discussion as to what they could be doing, because they are losing their credibility. People are losing trust. So that they need to look at the market, because you're interested in your business side, right? So losing your market should be a pain point that you want to address. From a very practical point of view, one of the few things that the center has been advocating is have your newsroom staffers all have some elementary understanding of fact checking, because the little mistakes that we see, sometimes they turn into very costly mistakes, can be quelled if you really treat them at the initial stage. So if someone says, I always say that, and a lot of people take offense when I say this, but in the newsrooms today, you really cannot have someone who is unable to do a very simple fact check. I think it has become something so important. And just like, you had to edit a copy earlier, you had to edit images, treat rushes, all of that. Just like that, being able to verify images and videos has become such an important thing and such a practical thing that you really have to. And there are so many courses, so many opportunities for you to learn that. So I would suggest that at least the newcomers to the industry should go through that phase of learning the basic digital skills of fact checking. But on top of the digital skills, how do you treat a bias? So Kehan was raising the point about how do you treat a bias? We all have inherent biases, and we bring them to the newsroom. And we practice those, we perpetuate those, right? So about my school, about my family, about my country, all kinds of things that they play on our mind. So, they need to be consciously guided through a process. There are simpler processes, and we just had the IFCN director speak about that. So what do? They work with teenagers. There is a teen fact check. And their language is entirely different. They use things like legit, we would say fake or false. So, something that appeals, but something that resonates with that audience, but makes, conveys a meaningful message. So the newsrooms have to look at the new models, engage really the young people, because they're digitally savvy, and they also have the opportunities, and they have years ahead to make some change, some dent, and the newsrooms have to invest in that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Kasun, අපි ප්‍රායෝගික අත්දකින්න දෙයක් තමයි මේ සමහර මිනිස්සු කියවන්නේ නැතිකම නැත්තම් මේක බලන්නේ නැහැ. ෆැක්ට් චෙක් සමහරට දිලුක්ෂි කිව්වා වගේ නිවුස් එකේ අපීල් වෙන්නේ නැහැ. අපි මේ ප්‍රායෝගික ප්‍රශ්න කොහොමද මුහුණ දෙන්නේ? කසුන් අපිට ඇහෙන්නේ නැහැ.
ප්‍රශ්නේදීත් අපි දැන් කලින් කියවුණා වගේ දැන් අපි දන්නවා ගොඩක් මෙතන ටිකක් කියවුණා මදි කියලාත් මට හිතෙනවා සෝෂල් මීඩියා එක්ක දැන් අපි දන්නවා තොරතුරේ මූලාශ්‍රය කොතන වුණත් ඕක අවසාන වශයෙන් ගොඩක් වෙලාවට හොමාරු වෙන්නේ සෝෂල් මීඩියා එක ඇතුළේ. එතකොට සෝෂල් මීඩියා එකට ආවට පස්සේ මේක අපි හිතනවට වඩා සෑහෙන්න වේගකින් සහ සෑහෙන්න ප්‍රමාණයකින් මේක හොමාරු වෙනව දකින්න පුළුවන්. දැන් උදාහරණයක් විදිහට ගත්තොත් social media users ලා ගත්තොත් ලංකාවේ අපේ 2021 වාර්තාව අනුව ඉන්නවා ජනගහනය 138ක් විතර. එතකොට මේ 138 මෙහෙම තිබුණට social media එක ඇතුලේ කතා වෙන දේ මම හිතනවා මේ ගොඩක් එළියට යනවා වැඩි මොකද ගොඩක් අය තොරතුරු ග්‍රහණය කරගන්න ප්‍රධාන විදියක් විදියට මේක පාවිච්චි කරන නිසා. ඉතින් ඒකෙදි කලින් දිල්රුක්ෂි කිව්වා වගේ ඩිජිටල් මාධ්‍ය සාක්ෂරතාවය කියන එක වැදගත් වෙනවා. කොහොමද අපි මේ දේවල් ආවට පස්සේ ෂෙයා කරන්න කලින් අපිට කරන්න පුළුවන් පොඩි ස්ටෙප් එකක් දෙකක් විතරක් මතක තියාගන්න පුළුවන් නම් හැම කෙනෙකුටම ඒක මම හිතනවා වැදගත් වෙයි කියලා ඩිජිටල් මාධ්‍ය සාක්ෂරතාවයේ පැත්තේ. දැන් අනිත් එක දැන් අපි දන්නවා COVID-19 තත්ත්වෙත් එක්ක කලින් නොතිබුණු ප්‍රමාණයක් විශේෂයෙන් මොබයිල් ෆෝන් එක තරුණ ළමයින්ට සහ මේ තරුණ ළමයින්ට අවශ්‍ය වුණා මේ පොඩි ළමයින්ටත් අවශ්‍ය වුණා මේ අධ්‍යාපන කටයුතු වලට. ඊට පස්සේ ඊට අමතරව ඒ අවශ්‍යතාවය සඳහා මිලදී ගත්තට පස්සේ අනිත් අය මේ කලින් තිබුණට වඩා ගොඩක් මේකේ යූසේජ් එක වැඩි වුණා. ඒකත් එක්ක සිද්ධ වෙනවා දැන් අලුතෙන් ෆෝන් එක අතට ගනිපු අයටත් සෝෂල් මීඩියා පාවිච්චි කරන අයටත් ටිකක් මේ ගැන දැනුවත් කිරීමක් කරන්න. මොකද මේ අර සාමාන්‍ය මාධ්‍ය පාවිච්චි කරලා සිදුවෙන හානියට වඩා ඉතා වේගෙන් මේකෙන් සිද්ධ වෙන්න පුළුවන් හානි ප්‍රචාරණය ගැන කලින් කතා කරන නිසා මම මේ නැවත මේ සෝෂල් මීඩියා ගැන ටිකක් කතා කරන්නේ ප්‍රචාරණ ව්‍යාපෘති ගැන. මේකෙන් වෙන්න පුළුවන් හානිය ගැන දැනුවත් කිරීම. ඒකෙදි අපි කලින් කිව්වා වගේ සිම්පල් ලක්න අතිනුත් කියුණා අපි කොහොමද ඉමේජ් එකක් වෙරිෆයි කරගන්නේ, අපි කොහොමද සාමාන්‍ය නිවුස් එකක් ආවට පස්සේ ඒකේ සෝස් එක තියෙනවද නැද්ද කියලා බලාගන්නේ. ඒකත් එක්ක අපේ කොහොමද බයස් හැන්ඩල් කරගන්නේ. අපි මොකක් නිවුස් එකක් දිහා බලද්දී අපේ තියෙන පර්සනල් බයස් පැත්තක තියලා අපි කොහොමද ඒක දිහා බලන්නේ කියලා වගේ පොඩි ස්කිල්ස් ටිකක් අපිට සිද්ධ වෙනවා. අත්‍යවශ්‍යම පුළුවන් නම් අපේ විෂය නිර්දේශ වලට හරිය අතුලත් කරලා මම හිතනවා ඉස්සරහට අවශ්‍ය වෙයි කියලා මේ වගේ දේවල් දැනුවත් කරන්න. ඒකත් එක්ක අපිට පුළුවන් ග්‍රාහකයෝ විදියට කියන්නේ අපිට සමහර වෙලාවට මේක අර අධ්‍යාපනික වශයෙන්ම නැතුව එදිනෙදා යාළුවොත් එක්ක සහ පවුලේ උදවියත් එක්ක කටයුතු කරද්දී උනත් අපිට මේ ගැන පොඩි බෙදා ගැනීමක් දැනුම බෙදා ගැනීමක් කරන්න පුළුවන්. මෙන්න මේ වගේ දේවල් ෂෙයා කරද්ද කලින් පොඩ්ඩක් බැලුවද නැද්ද, කොහොමද ඔයා මේක විශ්වාස කරන්නේ, විශ්වාස කරන්න පුළුවන් දෙයක්ද කියලා පොඩි ඒ වගේ හැම නිවුස් එකක්ම ඉවැලුවේට් කරන පොඩි ඇගීමක් කරන්න පුළුවන් නම් හැමෝටම මම හිතනවා වැදගත් වෙයි කියලා. අපිට කරන්න පුළුවන් දේ ඒ සම්බන්ධව ග්‍රාහකයන්ගේ පැත්තෙන් දැනුවත් කිරීම තමයි පුළුවන් හැම විදියකටම.
බොහොම ස්තුතියි කසුන් කුමාරගේ ශ්‍රී ලංකා පොත්පත් ආයතනයේ ෆැක්ට් සීකර් team lead. And thank you, Dr. Gehan. Thank you, Lakna. Thank you, Dilrukshi, for this discussion where we in a crisis. Kasun kiwage hamadissama moolasha kihipayakin check karaganna, moolasha kihipayakin balanna, double check karanna. And as Lakna said, check before you share. If you are not sure, don't share it. If you are not really sure, do a reverse image. And also, sometimes we say too much information is bad. So because to do and take informed decisions, check your facts. Thank you.